A little while back, I made a poll where I asked my audience which of my Heroes of Bronze short film shots I should deconstruct next. It was a close call, but in the end, this marathon battlefield shot won. And so I jumped into that huge scene once again to break down how I went about creating this, probably one of the most difficult shots from the entire short. Mostly due to the amount of elements it required. Not necessarily in the complexity of its techniques. In fact, even for this one, I've just used the same workflows I kept using throughout the whole production, only on a bigger scale. So let's dive in. Once again, I must stress that this video is not a step-by-step guide, just a breakdown of the techniques I've used, with some of my personal tips thrown on top. Still, last time it seems you've enjoyed this format, so I hope you'll find this video useful as well. Let's start with the environment. Though calling this an environment would be probably an overstatement. It's basically just a foreground plane for the ground, and on it there are some Megascans assets. In the material though, there is something worth noting. I have used this simple node setup to add blood stains all over the surface, and later I used the same one on soldiers, shields, armor and weapons. I basically just used this blood PNG image, I put it onto a BSDF shader, plugging the alpha into the appropriate socket and playing a little bit with the hue and value so that the blood isn't so red and bright. I also plugged the image into the specular socket and played with its value some more through this curves node. But that was mostly it. I then plugged this blood material over my base material. Just a regular sand material from Megascans, and in this mix shader node, I also used the alpha socket from the blood PNG, otherwise it would make the ground visible as well. Combined like this, I in fact put this node network onto a new group, and this one I was able to just throw onto any of my materials, instantly adding bloodstains. I've prepared a more advanced version of this node group for my patrons, and there you can download it and slap it onto any of your models. To complement this ground, I've duplicated one of my favorite ground models from Megascans onto it. Using the bridge tool, I just used the Lot 0 version of it with 2K textures, and I put the blood group all over it as well, 2 in fact, with some variations in the placement, and I was good to go. Over the ground plane, I added a displace modifier, and I used Megascan's texture displacement map to add some unevenness to it. Little details help to sell this stuff, but really, this shot wasn't really about the environment, it was mostly about the amount of soldiers and the action happening in it. Just as I showed you in the previous video, I've used 2D images for the background, one for the sky and one for the mountain. This is in fact the very same image, I just cut out the mountain and made it pop out into the 3D space a little bit to add at least a tiny bit of plasticity and parallax. That was really it though, and apart from playing with the curves and hues and plugging the images into emission socket to not be dependent on the scene's lighting, I didn't do anything else for the environment part of this shot. If you want to learn proper techniques of making environments in Blender, I have this course, Master 3D Environments in Blender. There, I teach everything I know about this topic, every workflow I've learned over the years, and I go into more elaborate ways to make nature scenes. So as I said, this shot is mostly about the many soldiers that needed to be created, animated and synchronized so that they look like they're reacting to each other, which was definitely the most difficult thing about it, and why it took me months to complete. When it comes to the actual creation of the characters and then their rigging, I talked about this extensively in my character creation course here on YouTube, and also in its extended version on Gumroad. What I want to talk about in this video though is Rococo and my workflow when using it. This shot was fairly extensive and it required a bit of planning, especially when it comes to the many animations it features. One of those days I gotta make a full course about this topic. But right now, I at least wanted to give you a general overview. Before the recording, I started with making Excel sheets, typing down animations I knew I wanted to record. So the main idea was that instead of the warriors spreading out into an all-out melee with enemies all around, which unfortunately you see in most Hollywood movies, but it really only happened when something unexpected occurred, or a formation was breaking, or if there was an ambush from behind. But this was supposed to be an organized battle line advancing against the enemy. Yes, a loose formation, but coherent enough to hold together. So for that, I needed hoplites who performed some battle actions at the start of the shot, but then fell behind their shields. I also knew that I wanted Nikephoros to be the center of the attention, shouting for order and forming the line. So that was my so-called hero animation, the primary one that everybody's eyes should look at. I was typing this all down, imagining what I could fill my shot with. Then I also wrote the reactionary animations on the side of the Persians. The falling down, the being hit, and all the retreat animations. In this sheet, you can actually see I have several rows with notes. I have the name of the animation, and sometimes I type in short description. Then I have takes, which details each take of the animation that I've recorded. I have props for animation where I need something in my hand to better perform it. Then I have notes where I can write anything that comes to mind related to the shot, and also the preferred take, where I either indicate which take I liked or which part of it I thought was good. This is very useful to do, because one always thinks he will remember the stuff from the day of the recording, but at least in my case, I always forget which take I liked best. So this bracket is where I put that info right after recording. This list arms me with much needed preparation for when I actually put on the suit and start capturing the data. As I mentioned numerous times on Heroes of Bronze, I've been using Rokoko mocap suit Mark I. Nowadays, the much improved Mark II model is available with more recording quality, less jittery motion, and less sliding. But I was able to make do, even though I'll be the first one to admit animations are not the strongest aspect of the short film. Armed with my Excel sheet, I jumped into the suit and tried my best to capture engaging animations, with some of them acting like they're reacting to each other. So sometimes I stepped, and next recording I pretended I'm falling down. Between each take, after recording data has inevitably broken down due to my excessive falling and too fast a movement, I had to do a special reset pose and then repeat. All in all, I performed about 8 recording days and captured hundreds of animations that I stored in the Rokoko Studio software. There, a simple cleanup is possible with various filters, giving you reasonably good results, and I sometimes use these tools, at least their default setup. But the real cleanup happened later, and that was in iClone, where I transferred all of the chosen takes from Rokoko Studio directly onto the characters in iClone. I will focus on this in a separate video. Once my animations were inside of iClone, I started to use the amazing cleaning tools that the latest versions offer. The biggest game changer was definitely the sliding cleanup tools of iClone. You can now simply activate this tool, choose which type of correction you want to employ, and let the software process it. Now, even by default, in my experience, this improves a lot of the floating immensely. But one can always go in, change the parameters, and even play around with the reach points, controlling precisely how long the feet stay on a given spot. And not just feet, you can easily motion correct hands too. There are also motion layers, which is especially great for anyone who wants to edit the captured animations by hand, adding various overlays and manual changes to them. You can simply choose to add a new layer on it. Let me name the layer Hand Raise, edit the position of the hands, and now the animation has changed, but you can always deactivate it. And what's more, you can even lower the weight for it, so that it's mixed in only slightly. Finally, you can keyframe this value to transition into different poses and back. So these two tools were definitely a huge thing for me when editing and cleaning up the recorded animations. I only wish I had time to polish the animations for all of the shots, but there was simply too many of them. The actual import of the characters and their animations happen through a CC Pipeline add-on, one that is free and with which you can simply export your characters into FBX format and then import them into Blender, with most important settings retained. The first thing I've usually done though was cleaning up the keyframes in Graph Editor. There is usually simply too many of them, which is slowing down the playback. You can safely use this clean keyframes option, which will reduce the amount of keys with minimal change to the animation. You can also choose the Clean Channels tool that will remove keyframes from any channels that don't have animation on them, removing a lot of unnecessary data. Most of my Blender workflow was spent by adding weapons and armor to the bones on the characters, polishing clothing, skinning models, and adjusting shape keys. Those are topics you can explore in other videos on this channel. What I often did was adjusting the animations in Graph Editor. There you need to manipulate with whole animation curves to be able to adjust the animated bones. For example, if I wanted to change the angle of the head, I had to go to the pose mode, select the head bone, and then in Graph Editor, type in Y quaternion rotation here to filter out that one particular channel, and then by selecting the whole curve and pushing it up, I was able to change the rotation of the head for the whole duration of the animation. I've spent a lot of time in this menu, and you can learn a lot about that in the free character creation tutorial series. Link is in the description, or again in the character creation package on my Gumroad. And then it was about putting all of the animated characters together, timing their animations to be at least somewhat in sync, and playing with what's visible in the shot, or more often, with hiding what sucks in the shot by placing something in the foreground. The low angle camera placement allowed me to hide a lot of ugly stuff, and the dynamic camera move helped even more, so you don't see all the geometry intersections, the bad skinning of clothing, and much more. That's however also the part of fun on these shots, getting creative in how to hide all the flaws and stuff you didn't have time to improve. As I mentioned in the previous breakdown video, having separate blend files for all sorts of characters with different animations helped me immensely. I built libraries of running soldiers, attacking soldiers, shield walls, even cavalry and civilians. These were often highly optimized with shared materials and textures and as few polygons as possible. And those I was then able to link into my scenes to quickly fill the background. Even so, this scene ended up with 12 million triangles, which, well, is quite a bit. On the other hand, my hero characters were usually appended into the scene, allowing me greater flexibility in their editing, pushing around of the shields, animating parts of the clothing, and more. Of course, there was also the arrow and spear particle simulation. Again, I broke this down in my previous video, and it is also available for my patrons. One thing I recommend when using these large scenes in Blender is to check this simplify option. By itself, it doesn't do anything, but if you lower this max number of subdivisions and also the children particles, yes, it will speed up the response significantly. Especially limiting the child particles is a huge deal. And of course, if you then render out the final result, everything will return to normal and the final look of the shot will be retained without the simplification. Dicing up this shot into layers was a key both for handling the scene and then for the rendering. I've showed you previously how big a role render layers played in finalizing the battle chart shot, and in this one it was no different. You can see with most of the layers activated, this blend file could barely move, even with the simplify option on. That's why I really took care to dice it up into foreground, midground and background layers, and I would put all that together later in the compositing stage. So I had the far background with the mountain and the sky, then some background running soldiers, and a background layer of battling Greeks and retreating Persians. And then there was the heaviest layer, the foreground, with everything placed on the ground plane, including the main heroes, the Greek phalanx, and the Persian battle line with the dead soldiers on the ground. For the final render, I used 512 samples with some open denoising, and to speed up everything, I was able to check the persistent data option, where basically all the textures were stored in the memory for the system to not have to go through them for every single frame. That sped up the render significantly, but at the same time I couldn't use the GPU rendering because then I would run out of GPU memory. With the CPU, I made sure to lower the tile size slightly. Blender does better rendering CPU tiles with smaller numbers like 1024 or 512. That was really it. No fancy render passes, just layers with the combined channels. With one exception, as usual, I've added this mist pass to the foreground layer to be later able to composite in dust in After Effects. For more info on how I prepare rendering of multiple render layers with setting up everything to save onto disk, definitely watch my video tutorial on CG Boost where I introduce you to this whole topic. Just as I've showed you in the previous breakdown, let's also go through my compositing project file. Surprisingly, it was fairly easy to composite this beast with its many layers. This was my working composition, and there was not much to it than the various layers I've rendered, with some masked out color layers added on top, a technique I introduced previously, and that helps me simulate the spreading of light. So let's go from the bottom. I started with the environment in the background, and right off the bat I did something interesting here, worth mentioning. I actually didn't like the way the rendered background looked, and I didn't really want to jump back to Blender to experiment with the images there. Instead, what I've done, and here's the beauty of compositing, I tracked the rendered environment layer and I created a null object where I put the tracking data. Then I parented another environment image to this null, and this tracking data then assured that the image was moving properly in the shot, repeating the camera move. This image, with some color grading, then proved much more suitable for the final result. It actually drew the eyes less and was better suited for the sunset atmosphere. I then continued adding the main layers, so the arrows, the javelins, and then there are the background Greeks and the midground fighters. On all of these layers, I use this very handy Real Smart Motion Blur add-on, which is an amazing tool I would recommend to everybody who likes compositing in After Effects. It basically generates a very accurate motion blur effect, and it does so in an eye blink, much faster than the default effect in After Effects. And now you may realize what I've done here. I in fact rendered these layers out of Blender without motion blur active. This resulted into a much faster rendering, and then I was able to slap the motion blur onto these in post-production, saving myself minutes and hours. Of course, the default motion blur quality that comes from Blender is much better than this, but for these background layers it just wasn't worth the extra render time. The same thing of course wasn't true for the main layer with all my main heroes. On that one, the motion blur was active already when rendering, and it gave me this nice, convincing result. Then it was time to add all the various color layers and the smoke elements that I've tracked into the shot. As I showed you, in After Effects you can track using this simple 2D tracker, or you can even do 3D tracking of your scene. But sometimes I like to add these sorts of tracking points into my blend scenes in various distances from the camera. Yeah, they are simple cubes, and these make for perfect tracking points. I just then place my 2D tracking point onto their corners, and using these I get the perfect tracking data that I then apply to a null object, and onto this object I parent my dust elements so that they move with the camera. Simple and easy, and oftentimes more reliable than trying to export camera data from Blender to After Effects. But if you have a reliable way of doing that, definitely let me know. One more note on this tracking method: do not render these tracking cubes with motion blur on. Instead, turn it off for better quality tracking. So, onto these tracked null objects, I parented these large colored layers. The choice of blending mode is really mostly about what you want to do with these layers. If you want to simulate a dust layer, you can leave this to normal blending so that they mostly cover your scene. If you want more of a glow effect from the sun, set it to soft light, screen, or add. I also always employ my favorite dust elements that I placed in between the various layers. Over everything, I usually like to add this sort of colder, bluish layer in the color of the sky, coming from the top like this. Once I'm done with the composition, I then take it and put it onto a new composition, which I name Final. There I place just a few adjustment layers with some final post-production effects. In this case, it was my favorite coloring tool, Mojo, that I employed on the whole Heroes of Bronze project, and it gives a great cinematic tint to your shots, and also it allows for quick contrast, vignette, and coloring control. It is part of the Red Giant package that I invested in many years ago, and it still serves me well. The final effect I added was the free chromatic aberration that I talked about last time. Link is of course in the description. And finally, the After Effects built-in grain effect. It's always been good enough for my needs. And with that, this scene was finished. just one of my many large-scale shots that I wrestled with for Heroes of Bronze. And ultimately, it was worth it, and it served its purpose well in the largest battle scene of the short film. Next time, we'll have a look at this one, another one of those huge, complicated shots that really stretched my skills to the breaking point. So until then, stay creative my friends, Martin out.